Okay, so this is a follow-up to the previous video I did on agentic pipelines. If you haven't checked that out, go check out that video first. It has a lot more context. But in short, agentic pipelines are my answer to how I think we can do agentic development at scale in a much more stable and effective way. Pair that with other tools that I've talked about, like policy as code, and I think you're well on your way to avoiding things like drift, context limits, and all the other issues with hallucination that come with AI. Today, I want to get into like how to actually do this and some of the building blocks associated with it. I will try to give you a template for how to do it yourself. And yeah, hopefully a good roadmap for you to get started. So with that, let's get started. Okay, so like I said in the beginning, the goal for this video is to help you understand how to actually build your own agentic pipelines. So I want to do two things in this video. I'm going to show you a little bit of a homemade one, which is a little bit guarded. I will show you like the template version that we're making right here, which is like pipeline blocks, and we might end up publishing that as a package. I also will show you the COI system that we have. So what we did in terms of how we got visibility and governance out of the pipelines is basically just a COI tool that publishes output to our app. And then we just gave those COI commands to Claude Code. And so depending on whether or not you want your own like governance app or visibility app as part of the pipelines, you can do that. I guess I will also just show you that briefly. As a reminder, this is like our governance app. Basically, any time that you kick off pipeline, you have a ticket, it has a manifest, all the build steps that it does, all the tests that it writes, all the commits that it makes, and then all the docs and research stuff that it does. Like this is our governance system. So like anytime there's a pipeline, there's a bunch of decisions it's making and so forth. And so it produces all that here and we can see that. Okay. There are a couple decisions that define like a pipeline system that you should do. Generally speaking, questions become like, do you want fresh subprocessors per block? So for example, in a lot of our agentic pipelines, it is a completely new Claude Code instance on a terminal. So like when one Claude Code instance stops, the manager Claude Code instance spins up a completely new process on the terminal. We then also just put artifacts directly onto the disk. So then like one pipeline produces artifacts, it puts it directly just into the repo, and then the next one can grab from it if it wants. We generally speaking do compressed summaries, not raw outputs, but on occasion, we also have all the raw stuff just like going into its own folder. That's going to be a choice for you. Tool scoping of the adapter. When you're running pipelines, you need to oftentimes scope the permission set to oftentimes have more permissions than it would otherwise have if it was doing it manually, because you never want it to get stopped by a manual step, because a lot of the processes are basically running like one step below, because like you're going to use a terminal to kick off the process, right? And then it's going to use sub processes to kick off all the different Claude Code instances. How you want your isolated work trees, profiles. We have started to use the concept of profiles in some of ours, where you like have a bunch of saved concepts and basically you create a profile concept, like a manager profile that is highly opinionated about X, Y, or Z. It's slightly more than just using like custom agents in like Codex or in Claude Code though, because we make a bunch of resources available specifically to certain profiles, and we like point to documentation that we have as well as certain skills and stuff like that. And it is useful. The other thing that I'll call out is events. So our pipelines, I can maybe try to find this, have a bunch of events built into them. Yeah. So our pipeline has a bunch of created, completed, failed, etc. So when we're looking at the governance system of like how our pipeline happened, we can actually see the events that were fired and so forth. And so this goes back to the concept of trying to create deterministic gate checks along with inherently a not deterministic system and trying to have an event-based system. And then the last one, as you're thinking about this, was runtime dependencies. Generally speaking, our pipelines don't have any runtime dependencies other than just like node, they run on node. Okay, so like how you could do your first one is like super simple. Like all this is, and this is where I want to distill the sort of secret of all these factories and all this other stuff. These are all essentially just like for loops with conditions, right? So what I will do is I'll say, I want to do a very basic getting started demo that ignores all the pipeline blocks, etc., and is simply a Claude Code instance that launches with an expected input and a manager that reviews their work. You can use Okay, so this is just going to be a very basic example of like how you can do this yourself. The reason I do this is because a lot of these, I think, systems and people try to make their like factories sound like so complex and like crazy and stuff. And if you look at our pipelines on paper, like an architecture demo, they actually do look relatively complex. But like when you break them down, it's not crazy by any means, right? It's simply just a bunch of different Quad Code instances with a bunch of different problems, with a bunch of different conditions on what it's producing, how to move to the next step, and so forth. And you can obviously make it as complex as you want. Like in our case, we have things like it creates its own branch, it does all these different things. But like equally speaking, if you're just sitting here and you're like, okay, I just want to do this once, right? You just simply make a Quad Code instance, right, that runs Quad Code. You make a function that kicks it off. You have a session directory, right, that holds both. And then it just runs this. And then it runs the manager. And then it decides, should it go through? And there's a round concept. And like you're done. And that took 30 seconds. So the reason I say this is not to, I think, minimize anything, but it's just to simply say I was struggling trying to take these like big God factories that people have been trying to say are worth like hundreds of millions of dollars because they've solved software development, and simply going, okay, like I have a very specific thing I need, right? In this situation, I think this backend is convex that I was working in. And there's a very specific like type system and some other things that like it was struggling with, right? And so instead I just made a pipeline that had a manager system that was extremely opinionated about some of that stuff in this. And then my whole agentic pipeline system has just spun out from that. And then I was like, what if it runs on its own branch and it just does its own checkout? What if it actually, instead of just going one-to-one, it has a planning one that spins out 4 or 5 in parallel, right? And that's all I did. And you can do that too. It's really not that hard. So to talk about like, then like, where do you take this? Then what we did is we turned it into like pipeline blocks, right? And so if you look at a pipeline, this is probably way too small, right? So developer runs it. You have your pipeline, which is like the scripts that you have here. So these are your different pipelines. You have your pipeline blocks, which is like some of the core functionality. You have like adapters. So if it talks to anything like that, you have like recipes. So these are going to be like reusable, basically blocks. And then you have like profiles, which have a bunch of like different instructions and stuff like that. And then you have your actual like CLI system, which is basically what it uses to do a lot of the pushes. And then you have this dashboard app. So we just built a dashboard app to create the visibility into the pipeline system. You should do it too. I've had a couple people actually ask me if we'll open source it. I don't know that we're going to open source it, but we might just make it available for free for people. We'll figure that out. And so if we look at it, and you can see this, you have your pipelines, you have your pipeline blocks, core, right, and like same thing. One time, 5 adapters. So the runtime is the core. Everything else just plugs in through adapters. Swap the agent's adapter for a different LLM and different personalities. So the point here in what I want to try to emphasize about an agentic pipeline is that there is no right and wrong. There is no, oh, you have to do a manager after a step. You have to do research steps. Like a lot of our pipelines we're constantly experimenting with, because what you find is that they're good at different things in different ways depending on your code base. So we have pipelines that try to do TDD style development where it creates all its tests first, it verifies that they're all red, then it does the coding, and then it verifies they're all green, right? And the ability for that to run is really different in success rates dependent on the code base it's in as well as the size of code. And so we're tweaking that all of the time depending on the code base that we're running it in. And once again, this is, if there's anything when you're building this that I want you to take away from it, it's that as a concept, this works super and you should be doing it, but it is not something that like is a, I guess, recipe for lack of a better word. There's no one recipe that says, oh, here's the TDD pipeline that you should have that works for everything. Because like anyone who's selling that is basically full of crap. I'm trying to swear less in life. And so, oh, my profiles, right? Oh, I have a development profile is perfect. No, it's like my profiles work really well because I've optimized them around convex. I've optimized them around the front end that I have. I've optimized them around the policy as code concepts that I have and so forth. And so like, it's more important that you understand the core components of it. And like even this, for the record, like you don't have to do, like we tend to do manifests at the beginning of our pipeline, which like define the scope of the pipeline. Everything is broken into steps, right? Those steps emit artifacts at the end of each step. There's events, and then there's a gate at the end, right? And that process works well for us, but that process doesn't have to work well for you. The whole point is that you need to figure out what works for your code base and do it yourself. Same thing with this, like every block runs a scope personality. Like we've tried to have planners, researchers, executors, reviewers. And this is, I think, the difference between this as a video and I guess other like factory videos is like, People have asked me to put this on GitHub. I'll probably end up putting some version of this in GitHub, but the point of this video is not that you should go to GitHub and download someone's magic magic factory. It's that like you can go and build this stuff yourself very quickly. All right, each block's one function. Yeah, none of this is super intense, right? So you have your review loop, right? Your functions, one pipeline, moment by moment. So here's an example actually, right? So like you look at something like this and you're like, oh my God, that is complex, right? That looks so complex. And this is why people get to raise like millions of dollars, because they're like, hey, this is our factory, right? This is an example of my pipeline. It looks really complex. And like, to be fair, it's like I've spent 3-4 weeks really optimizing it. And so yes, it is fairly complex, but it's not crazy and it's not rocket science. It's the same things. All right, so let's go back, right? So if we had our demo one, which is basically you have run quad, you have main. If you want to expand on that, right? All you do is you just add more concepts. So in this case, and this is like the homemade version, and like same thing, like the productized versions up here in this blocks, right? But the idea is that you just add these like functions, or in some cases you can add combined things like TDD cycle. Everything is going to basically expect inputs. So if you were to run this, the first thing it says is like, what feature do you want to develop, and ask questions and so forth. The big things to be aware of, right, is being able to do things in parallel and so forth. I guess word of caution, you're going to burn a lot of tokens doing this, but my argument is you would have burned those tokens anyways, largely speaking, just doing it by hand. The one thing that you have to be super careful of, I think, is just generally the time and effort spinning up fresh instances of Claude code takes when it comes to burning tokens. But I think Claude is actually even recently starting to do some ways to pass it. Where and how things like policy as code fit into this, like, it is also up to you, but like we tend to do it before the managers review stuff. So like basically after a development agent runs it, then it does the policy as code. It only is allowed to give it to the manager if it passes. Yeah, if you want more detail, I guess I can give more detail in terms of this, but really at its core, like the goal for this is like how to build it. And like, I think that this basic demo does a really easy example of it. And then the big thing is just start to layer logic on top of it, right? Layer its ability to check out its own branches, layer its ability to run stuff, and go for that. Yeah, with all that, yeah, this is Agentic Pipelines. Hit me up in the comments if you have any questions, thoughts. Would love to get more into detail of it, go into it, but it's completely changed, I think, development, at least for us over the last few months in terms of output and our ability to produce stuff at scale and be running a lot of this at once. Pair this with a concept like policy as code, and you're well on your way to doing agentic development. That's all I got for you. Get out of here. Appreciate it. Hit me up on LinkedIn if you want to talk more. Subscribe and like to the channel. And yeah, don't be a stranger. Talk soon. Bye.